In the mountains of Kentucky, silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. When state worker Daniel Cross drove up a remote dirt road in 1987, he thought he was checking on another case of neglect. Instead, he uncovered something unimaginable. Inside a collapsing shack lived boys who had never heard a bird sing, never heard their father's voice, never heard anything at all. Their heads were swollen, their eyes unnervingly wide, their movements clumsy and unstable. And yet, the man who raised them looked on with pride, convinced these afflictions were signs of divine favor. But the truth was darker. What Daniel found was not just poverty, not just isolation. It was the result of over 2 centuries of men marrying within their own bloodline. 11 generations of fathers and sons bound to a doctrine of purity, a doctrine that turned silence into destiny and deformity into a twisted badge of honor. Before we begin, if you enjoy gripping true stories that reveal the hidden corners of history, make sure to like and subscribe. And share this video with a friend who enjoys real-life mysteries stranger than fiction. The sound of gravel crunching beneath tires echoed through the Kentucky hills that October morning in 1987. Investigator Daniel Cross, a veteran state worker, felt uneasy. He had handled tough cases before, but this one felt different. He followed the dirt path until a sagging shack appeared ahead. The wooden boards leaned inward, the roof barely held together. Yet it wasn't the structure that unsettled him. It was the overwhelming silence surrounding it. Daniel stepped out of his state-issued sedan and immediately noticed the absence of sound. No barking dogs, no humming radios, no voices of young boys playing. The silence clung to the air like a heavy blanket. He walked up the broken steps and knocked firmly. The door creaked open, revealing a man who looked decades older than he was. His hair was prematurely gray, his eyes hollow, his face lined with suffering. The man did not respond to Daniel's introduction. He stared blankly, unmoving, as if he hadn't heard a word. Daniel tried louder, but the man remained still, his silence more unnerving than outright hostility. Movement behind the man caught Daniel's attention. From the shadows, a boy shuffled forward. His head was unnaturally large, his eyes spaced too widely, his jaw slack. He staggered, clumsy, as though missing a crucial sense. The boy tugged on the older man's sleeve, using crude hand motions. It wasn't sign language Daniel recognized from training. It was primitive, a makeshift communication system passed down only between these isolated men. Daniel scribbled on his notepad, "Is this your son?" He showed the paper. The man nodded slowly, pointing proudly toward the boy. His lips moved as if forming words, but no sound emerged. One by one, more boys appeared. Each carried the same distinctive features: enlarged skulls, widely set eyes, misshapen teeth, unstable gaits. All moved awkwardly. None reacted to Daniel's voice, every one of them completely deaf. Daniel felt his training kick in. He documented everything: their appearances, their movements, their silence. It wasn't just disability. It was something deeper. These boys weren't just related. They were mirror images of one another. He wrote another question. "Are these all your sons?" The man nodded vigorously, pointing to himself, then to them. A rare smile broke across his tired face, pride glimmering where most would see tragedy. Daniel's pen scratched quickly. "Where is their father?" The man's expression faltered. He looked nervously toward the back. A figure soon emerged, tall, thin, carrying the same unsettling features. Another man, another Whitaker, silent and staring. When the second man stepped closer, Daniel froze. Their similarities were undeniable. The same nose, same jawline, same wide-set eyes. They weren't just kin. They were practically copies, brothers who looked more like twins than distant relatives. Daniel wrote a blunt question. "Are you and he related?" The first man's face drained of color. The two exchanged frantic gestures, sharp and agitated, their crude language breaking the stillness with intensity despite the absence of sound. The second man snatched the paper, crumpling it. He jabbed his finger toward Daniel's car, ordering him to leave. The hostility was clear, but Daniel had already seen enough to know this was no ordinary neglect case. As he walked back toward his sedan, his mind raced. Deaf sons, all malformed. Two fathers who shared blood too closely. Generations of silence pressing down upon this house. The air felt heavier with each step. Sitting in his car, Daniel finally radioed his supervisor. His voice cracked as he described what he'd witnessed. Multiple boys, all deaf, all disabled. Two men raising them clearly related. Something here isn't neglect. It's far worse. He looked back one last time. Through a shattered window, faces pressed against the glass. Sons and fathers, silent, staring outward from a world of perpetual quiet. The sight branded itself into Daniel's memory forever. As the radio crackled back, Daniel gripped the wheel. He hadn't just uncovered silence. He had stumbled upon the opening chapter of one of the darkest family secrets in American history. A secret written in bloodlines. The investigation deepened quickly. Within days, Daniel Cross sat in a cramped office with his supervisor, Thomas Bradley, and Detective Richard Hale. Documents and census records were spread across the desk like pieces of a grim puzzle. Thomas pulled a large genealogical chart from a folder. The lines twisted back on themselves, looping unnaturally. Brothers marrying brothers' sons, uncles binding themselves to nephews, cousins pairing within cousins. 11 generations of closed bloodlines stared back at them. At the top stood Jeremiah Whitaker, born in 1760. He left Virginia with his brothers in 1785, founding a secluded sect called the Holy Brethren. Their doctrine was simple but dangerous. Blood must remain pure among men. The Brethren believed mixing with outsiders corrupted divine essence. Jeremiah preached that only Whitaker blood carried God's favor. To preserve that purity, he ordered his sons, nephews, and cousins to marry exclusively among themselves, binding generation after generation. Richard Hale studied the chart, his jaw tightening. So they never allowed outsiders? Thomas nodded grimly. Not once. Each union tightened the noose. With every generation, the genetic damage compounded. Deafness became common, deformities spread like wildfire. Daniel flipped through marriage records. Each page revealed grotesque pairings. Brothers wedded to their brothers' sons, nephews joined with uncles, cousins joined repeatedly until their names blurred into repetition. It wasn't neglect. It was systematic destruction masked as devotion. By the third generation, records showed the first cases of total deafness. Yet Jeremiah's sons interpreted it as holiness, proof that silence drew them closer to God. Affliction was not shame. It was divine evidence. Letters preserved from the era spoke chillingly. "Our boys are marked with holy silence," one patriarch wrote. "They hear nothing of worldly corruption, only the voice of the Lord." To them, deafness was exaltation. By Generation 5, physical deformities became widespread. Enlarged skulls, twisted spines, crippled limbs. Yet the records framed these abnormalities as heaven's mark. The more unusual the body, the more blessed the Whitaker men believed their sons had become. Thomas tapped the chart, shaking his head. "Look here. By Generation 7, almost half the sons are deaf. By Generation 9, nearly every boy shows deformities. And still, the Whitakers praised it as proof of purity." Daniel leaned back, unsettled. This wasn't ignorance. This was deliberate. Each generation of men had indoctrinated the next, convincing them that affliction was blessing, that deformity was sacred, and that silence was God's chosen gift. Richard scribbled notes. "What's staggering is the survival rate. By the 10th generation, over half the sons didn't live past childhood. Those who did carried severe disabilities. Yet still, the cycle never broke." Thomas added grimly, Because the men believed they were closer to God. They saw tragedy not as warning, but as reward. Every son born misshapen or deaf confirmed their doctrine of purity. Daniel read another line aloud. Let no Whitaker blood be poisoned by strangers. Blessed are the deaf, for they hear God alone. The words revealed fanaticism passed down like scripture from father to son. By the mid-1900s, the Whitakers withdrew completely. No schools, no hospitals, no outsiders. Sons were born in the mountains, raised by fathers and uncles, taught that their suffering was divine privilege. Isolation became both shield and prison. And now, 11 generations later, the results stood before them. Boys entirely deaf, physically twisted, intellectually stunted. They were not accidents. They were the living legacy of a bloodline trapped in its own dogma. Daniel looked at Thomas and Richard, his stomach heavy. This isn't just a family history. This is a doctrine of blood, and the Whitaker men chose it, generation after generation, until silence became destiny. The three men sat in silence, the chart lying open between them. The lines of blood were more than genealogy. They were scars etched across centuries, scars that had birthed a dynasty of silence. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that the Whitaker men weren't simply bound by tradition. They had developed a twisted system, a deliberate calculation of who should breed and why. At first, the system was crude. Brothers paired with brothers' sons, uncles with nephews. But by the mid-1800s, records showed the Whitakers kept ledgers, noting physical traits, assigning value to deafness, deformities, and other abnormalities. One diary entry from an early patriarch revealed chilling logic. Silence is most blessed. Wide skulls mark strength. Crooked bodies reveal chosen blood. Traits that most saw as tragic were cataloged as marks of spiritual favor. The Whitakers created what they called sacred numbers. Each trait was given points. Deafness ranked highest. Enlarged skulls followed. Crooked limbs, twisted spines, clouded eyes, all recorded as blessings, signs of heavenly design. Daniel Cross studied the ledger with disgust. He realized these men weren't blindly stumbling into deformity, they were pursuing it. Each generation sought to maximize blessings, deliberately pairing sons with cousins who showed the strongest signs. Detective Richard Hale muttered, "It's eugenics in reverse." Instead of breeding for strength, intelligence, or survival, the Whitakers bred for silence, weakness, and deformity. They celebrated collapse as proof they were reaching closer to God. Thomas Bradley pointed to an 1870 entry. 2 deaf sons joined, produced 4 silent heirs. Truly divine. The writing read not as despair, but triumph. To them, disability confirmed the purity of Whitaker blood. By generation 6, patterns emerged. Deaf sons were paired with other deaf cousins. Boys with swollen skulls were matched to cousins with twisted spines. Traits were combined deliberately, as if designing an entirely new form of man. The records revealed pride when offspring displayed compounded traits. He is deaf and twisted, blessed twice over. The Whitakers saw accumulation of suffering as a higher state of being, the ultimate expression of divine blood. Daniel struggled to process it. They were running experiments on their own sons, he said. Generation after generation, men turned their children into living test subjects, cataloged, measured, reduced to numbers. Richard agreed grimly. And worse, they believed they were succeeding. Each crippled son was seen not as tragedy but as victory. The more broken the boy, the closer he stood to heaven. As decades passed, the system grew increasingly methodical. Charts detailed which cousin should father sons with which nephew, always based on the tally of blessings. This wasn't chaos. It was planned, calculated, ritualized genetic destruction. By the early 1900s, deafness had become nearly universal. Yet the Whitaker men rejoiced. Silence was their crown jewel. Sons born without hearing were paraded as proof that the sacred numbers worked. One patriarch wrote, "When all our sons are deaf, we shall be free of worldly lies. Only the voice of God shall remain." It was not delusion alone, it was doctrine. The doctrine infected every decision. Sons who displayed fewer deformities were considered cursed, less holy. They were sometimes isolated, treated as though they were tainted by outside corruption, punished for appearing too normal. Thomas shook his head as he read. Imagine being a boy born healthy in that house. Instead of being celebrated, you'd be condemned. Survival meant being twisted, crippled, deaf, or else you weren't truly Whitaker. The sacred mathematics wasn't just genealogy. It was theology. Generations of men turned suffering into sacred arithmetic, convincing themselves that silence, deformity, and death were steps toward divine perfection. By the time Daniel Cross uncovered the 11th generation, the arithmetic had reached its inevitable conclusion. The Whitaker sons stood as the final product, deaf, deformed, intellectually shattered, the living embodiment of 2 centuries of sacred numbers. 2 weeks after his first encounter, Daniel Cross returned to Cloverlick Road. This time he wasn't alone. With him came Thomas Bradley, Detective Richard Hale, and Dr. Samuel Ortiz, a geneticist from Louisville. Their convoy stopped near the sagging shack. This time, there was sound. A heavy, rhythmic thumping behind the house, followed by low moans. The silence of Daniel's first visit was broken, unsettlingly so. At the door, the same gray-haired man appeared. His eyes were sharper now, more alert, suspicion flickering across his face. He recognized Daniel instantly, and his gestures became frantic, hostile. Daniel raised a paper with large words. "We brought a doctor to help your sons." The man read it, then launched into a flurry of crude signs, his hands sharp, agitated, almost desperate. The sons emerged again, one by one. In the clearer light of November, their deformities were harsher. Heads bulged grotesquely, jaws slack, spines bent. They staggered with unstable gaits, struggling to keep balance. Dr. Ortiz whispered, shaken. Their inner ears never developed properly. That explains the staggering. They're navigating a world without hearing, without equilibrium. Their bodies reveal generations of collapsing genes. The sight was harrowing. Then another boy limped out. His leg dragged lifelessly behind him. Another followed with twisted arms, hands fused into malformed shapes. Each new son revealed the catastrophic weight of the sacred mathematics. But the worst came from the backyard. That rhythmic thumping grew louder. When Daniel and Ortiz stepped around the shack, their breath caught. A crude wooden cage sat in the dirt, reeking of filth. Inside was a boy no older than 6. His skull was grotesquely swollen, his eyes clouded white, his limbs contorted. Crude ropes restrained him, keeping him bound inside the wooden structure like livestock. The boy moaned, not words, not even cries, but guttural sounds of pain and desperation. Ortiz knelt, horrified. Hydrocephalus, severe spinal deformities, complete blindness, profound disability. This boy has been surviving in unspeakable conditions. The gray-haired father appeared behind them, clutching a wooden mallet. His eyes darted nervously as he gestured furiously, trying to explain. His movements conveyed shame and anger, but also a strange defensiveness. Daniel scribbled quickly. "How long has he been like this?" The man hesitated, then raised his fingers, flashing them 3 times. 30 months. The boy had been trapped here for over 2 years. Detective Hale clenched his fists. "He's being kept like an animal." Ortiz nodded gravely. "This isn't just inbreeding anymore. This is catastrophic neglect. And yet, they don't even realize it's abuse. To them, it's protection." As they documented, another son appeared, carried in the arms of the second man. This boy was frail, 4 years old, unable to walk, his limbs thin and weak, his head far too large. Daniel counted silently. He had seen 4 sons on his first visit. Now he counted 6, with one more rumored. Then his eyes fell on a small mound of dirt behind the fence. His chest tightened. "That's a grave," he whispered. Ortiz paled. They had discovered 6 sons alive, but one lay buried, a casualty of the bloodline's collapse. The silence around that mound was deafening. Ambulances were called immediately. As sirens wailed in the distance, Daniel realized the truth. He was witnessing the end of an experiment 2 centuries in the making. The Whitaker men's silence was collapsing under its own weight. As the sons were prepared for evacuation, Daniel glanced at the fathers. Their frantic gestures carried both fear and relief. Deep down, they seemed to know their world of silence had finally been broken forever. Weeks after the boys were removed from Cloverlick Road, Daniel Cross sat in the archives of the Kentucky Department of Community Services. Alongside him were Thomas Bradley, Detective Richard Hale, and Dr. Samuel Ortiz. On the table lay a collection of yellowed documents, medical reports, and forgotten journals. These were not merely family records. They were evidence of something larger, something orchestrated beyond the Whitaker men themselves. Dr. Ortiz spread out correspondence dating back to the late 1800s. The letters bore the name of Dr. Friedrich Kellner, a German-born scientist who had settled in America. His work focused on hereditary modification. Kellner's journals revealed a horrifying truth. He hadn't just studied isolated Appalachian communities, he had experimented on them. The Whitaker men weren't solely victims of their own fanaticism, they were subjects of deliberate genetic manipulation. One entry chilled the room. The Whitaker line provides ideal material. Their devotion to purity ensures continuity. I have introduced traits that will compound across generations: cranial expansion, auditory failure, skeletal distortion. The words dripped with clinical detachment. Richard Hale slammed a fist against the table. So this wasn't just religion. This was science exploiting them. They weren't only fanatics, they were lab rats. His anger was barely contained. Ortiz nodded grimly. Kellner used isolation as a laboratory. Their beliefs made them compliant. He introduced mutations, tracked them across generations, and celebrated the deformities as proof his experiments were working. It was calculated cruelty. Daniel scanned financial records. Payments exchanged between Appalachian patriarchs and Kellner's Institute revealed an arrangement. Men actually paid for blessings. They believed the scientists' work made their sons holier, closer to divine silence. Thomas exhaled slowly. Generations of boys deliberately crippled, deafened, twisted, not by accident, but by design. Fathers convinced themselves they were preserving purity, while a scientist recorded every deformity as data. Ortiz opened another file, revealing medical charts from the 1920s and 1930s. They tracked Whitaker sons like experimental animals. Each skull measurement, each malformed limb, each dead child, logged, graphed, analyzed with detached precision. The chilling revelation grew deeper. Kellner's letters hinted at other lineages. The Hartwell men, the Morrison men, the Blackwood men. All had been drawn into his experiments, convinced through doctrine to sacrifice their sons. Richard whispered, "How many boys grew up like this? How many graves in these mountains hold the results of his so-called science?" The silence in the room confirmed none wanted to guess. Then Ortiz revealed the most disturbing discovery. Recent brain scans of the surviving Whitaker sons showed unusual neurological activity. Their brain waves synchronized, patterns emerging in regions most men never used consciously. Kellner wasn't just trying to destroy them, Ortiz said. He was trying to create something. He believed by stripping away senses and twisting biology, he could open doors to higher perception, even psychic ability. Daniel shuddered. The crude gestures the boys used, the eerie silence, the strange coordination between them. It might not have been primitive communication. It could have been the very thing Kellner intended. Thomas's voice was heavy. So, for over a century, men weren't just breeding within bloodlines. They were unknowingly advancing a scientific experiment, one meant to create sons who existed half in our world, half beyond. The revelation reframed everything Daniel had seen. The deformed boys at Cloverlick Road weren't only products of fanatic fathers. They were the legacy of men used as test subjects by a scientist long dead. As the meeting ended, Daniel looked out the window toward the Kentucky hills. Somewhere out there, more sons might still be living in silence, not just victims of misguided fathers, but creations of science in the shadows. The interrogation room was prepared carefully. Across the table sat two Whitaker men, Ray Whitaker and his brother Benjamin Whitaker. Facing them was Dr. Patrick Nolan, a communication specialist, supported by Thomas Bradley and Daniel Cross. On the table lay stacks of paper, markers, and simple picture cards. Cameras rolled silently, capturing every gesture, every expression. For the first time, officials hoped to break through the Whitaker brothers' crude sign language. Dr. Nolan wrote the first question. "Do you understand why your sons were taken?" Ray and Benjamin looked at one another, then gestured rapidly. Their motions were sharp, distressed, but full of genuine confusion. Ray reached for the marker. His handwriting was shaky, but his words were clear. "Sons are blessed. Why taken?" The room fell silent. To them, the boys' deformities were not tragedy, but divine proof. Nolan wrote again. "What do you mean, blessed?" Benjamin took the pen. "Marked by God. Closer to heaven. Pure blood makes holy sons." His eyes showed conviction, not deceit. He believed every word he wrote. Ortiz leaned forward, whispering to Daniel, "They don't see disability at all. They see transformation. In their minds, every abnormality is elevation. Suffering proves closeness to God." It was fanaticism crystallized into theology. Nolan pressed further. "Who taught you this?" Ray scribbled quickly. "Father taught, grandfather taught, great-grandfather taught, always truth." The doctrine had been passed from man to man, generation after generation, never questioned, never diluted. Benjamin added another line. "Jeremiah saw God's truth, pure blood forever." It was clear. The Whitaker men had been indoctrinated from birth. Silence, deformity, and pain weren't accidents to them. They were sacred inheritance. Nolan asked carefully, "How are you and your brother related?" Benjamin paused, then wrote, "Benjamin is brother, Benjamin is cousin, Benjamin is chosen." They no longer distinguished between roles. All ties were one, bound by purity. Richard Hale muttered from behind the glass. "They don't even recognize incest as wrong. To them, blood mixing with blood isn't corruption, it's salvation." The logic was horrifying, yet disturbingly consistent. Nolan wrote again, "Why not marry outsiders?" Ray reacted with visible horror. He scribbled furiously. "Outside blood is poison. Sons from outsiders are cursed. We keep Whitaker blood pure." To them, outsiders were contamination itself. The questioning turned toward the boys. Nolan asked, "Do you know why your sons cannot hear?" Benjamin smiled faintly as he wrote, "Silent sons hear God better. Not hearing world is gift. Deaf is holy." Ortiz exhaled heavily. They actually believe deafness is superior. They've built an entire worldview where disability is sacred. It's not cruelty in their eyes, it's devotion. Daniel nodded grimly, his stomach tightening. When asked about the caged boy, Ray scribbled, "Joshua too blessed to walk. Head too full of God's wisdom. We protect him. We keep him safe." He didn't recognize abuse, only guardianship. Benjamin added, "Most blessed sons need most care. Their suffering makes us holy. Raising broken sons makes fathers closer to heaven." The logic was twisted, yet consistent with generations of doctrine. Nolan tested their belief further. "What if doctors could help your sons hear?" Both men reacted with panic. "No help. Hearing is curse. Hearing sons lose blessing. Sons will go to hell if cursed by hearing." The interview stretched on for hours. Every question revealed the same pattern. Affliction equaled blessing, deformity equaled proof, silence equaled holiness. The Whitaker men lived in a reality inverted from the outside world. As the session closed, Nolan asked one final question. "If you could change anything about your sons, what would it be?" Ray and Benjamin signed for a long time before Benjamin wrote, "Only wish sons more blessed." The room went silent. The doctrine of blessed suffering had consumed them completely. To the Whitaker men, every scar, every twisted bone, every deaf ear was not tragedy, it was triumph. The November sky hung heavy as the convoy returned to Clover Lick Road. This time, Daniel Cross was not alone. Multiple officers, doctors, and social workers, all men, joined him for the long-anticipated intervention. As they arrived, the shack loomed silent. The Whitaker brothers stood waiting at the doorway, their expressions tense. Their hands moved rapidly in crude gestures, broadcasting both defiance and fear at the same time. Daniel raised a board with bold writing. "We are here to help your sons." The older Whitaker scowled, shaking his head violently. But behind him, the boys began to emerge, one by one. Each son carried visible marks of 11 generations of collapse, heads bulging, limbs twisted, eyes clouded. The younger boys shuffled awkwardly, while the older ones leaned on walls for balance, their movements unstable and frail. Dr. Samuel Ortiz stepped forward with his bag. His gaze lingered on the most disabled boy, the one discovered in the wooden cage. His professional calm barely concealed the weight of what he was witnessing. Officers surrounded the shack, ensuring no resistance. Thomas Bradley directed the team firmly, assigning roles. "We secure the sons first, then document. No one leaves until every boy is accounted for and safe." The Whitaker brothers gestured frantically, pointing toward the mountains, their signs urgent and wild. Daniel scribbled a message. "More sons elsewhere?" Their frantic gestures only grew, but the meaning was unclear, leaving suspicion hanging in the air. Ambulances rolled into position, engines idling. Medical teams carefully lifted each boy. Their fragile bodies trembled under touch, as though unused to care. For the first time, silence was pierced by the sound of approaching sirens. Daniel noted the reactions of the fathers. Their eyes carried both panic and relief. They clung to one another, gesturing wildly, torn between fear of losing their bloodline and relief that their burden was ending. Dr. Ortiz examined the caged boy more closely. Hydrocephalus, twisted spine, near-total blindness. "He survived against all odds," Ortiz murmured. "But survival here has been torment. We remove him today, or he will not last." Detective Richard Hale uncovered a mound of dirt behind the shack, a small grave, carefully shaped. His voice was heavy. "One son didn't survive." Silence settled over the group, sharper than any words. Thomas ordered the scene photographed thoroughly. "History must record this. No one will believe it otherwise." Cameras clicked, capturing the shack, the grave, the boys, all evidence of a bloodline collapsing under its own doctrine. The Whitaker brothers resisted briefly, but officers restrained them. Their crude signing became desperate. Daniel wrote quickly, "Your sons will live." They froze, reading carefully, and for a moment, their defiance softened into something like resignation. One by one, the boys were carried into waiting ambulances. Their silence, once oppressive, was now broken by the shuffle of boots, the hiss of oxygen tanks, and the low murmur of medical orders. Daniel watched closely as the convoy prepared to leave. The sight was haunting. Sons bundled in stretchers, loaded into vehicles, their pale faces reflecting 2 centuries of choices made in the name of purity. For the first time, the shack stood empty. The Whitaker brothers remained on the porch, hands bound, staring into the distance. Their world had ended, their bloodline broken by forces they could no longer control. As the ambulances departed, Daniel whispered to Thomas, "This is more than rescue. This is the end of an experiment. The bloodline is broken today." Thomas nodded, his face grim, eyes unblinking. Behind them, the shack sagged quietly, as if collapsing under the weight of its secrets. 11 generations of silence had ended, not with divine blessing, but with sirens, restraints, and the breaking of the bloodline. 3 weeks later, the Kentucky State Archives overflowed with records. Daniel Cross, Thomas Bradley, Detective Richard Hale, and Dr. Samuel Ortiz gathered in a dim conference room. On the table lay charts, diaries, and genetic reports. Dr. Ortiz spread a massive family tree across the surface. 11 generations of Whitaker men stretched from 1785 to the present. The lines curled inward, looping endlessly, showing a bloodline that devoured itself across centuries. Every name connected back to another Whitaker. Brothers marrying brothers' sons, uncles marrying nephews, cousins intertwining repeatedly. The bloodline wasn't random, it was systematic. A closed circle of men, bound by doctrine and deception. Beside the tree lay journals from early patriarchs. One entry read, "Suffering is proof. Deaf sons are holy. Broken sons are chosen." The words carried a chilling conviction, passed from father to son like sacred scripture. Daniel whispered, "They celebrated every affliction." Ortiz nodded grimly. They weren't blind to consequences. They embraced them. They believed each deformity brought their sons closer to God. The doctrine wasn't ignorance. It was faith weaponized against blood. Richard Hale studied mortality records. Over 60% of Whitaker's sons died before adulthood. Graves cover the hillsides. Yet each death was called proof. Instead of stopping, they declared their bloodline more sacred. The room grew heavy with silence. These weren't merely victims of superstition. They were engineered believers, men who twisted genetics into theology, convinced that suffering proved purity. Every grave became fuel for their belief. Ortiz unfolded medical charts of the rescued boys, enlarged skulls, collapsed spines, deafness, blindness. "This is the final stage," he said quietly. "The line cannot continue. Sterility, mortality, genetic collapse. It's irreversible." Daniel stared at the files. "So, the Whitaker sons we saved are the last?" Ortiz confirmed. "Yes. The bloodline ends here. 11 generations of silence have reached their final note." Thomas added grimly, "But there may be others. Kellner's experiments spread. The Hartwell men, the Morrison men, the Blackwood men, all tied into this. Their silence may still echo somewhere in these mountains." Richard muttered, "So this wasn't just a Whitaker tragedy. It was a network of bloodlines twisted by science and sustained by faith." His notebook filled quickly with questions that had no comforting answers. Daniel leaned back, haunted by memory. He saw again the boys' faces pressed against broken glass, their silence not natural but engineered. They weren't only victims of fanatic fathers, they were creations of calculated cruelty. Ortiz placed one final document on the table. A letter from Dr. Kellner to a Whitaker patriarch. "Your sons represent the next step. They exist between worlds, closer to divine perception than ordinary men." The implication hung in the room. Had the experiment succeeded? The crude gestures, the eerie coordination, the synchronized brainwaves, were the Whitaker sons communicating in ways no other men could? The question lingered, unanswerable. Thomas broke the silence. Whether divine or not, the cost was unbearable. Generations of boys condemned to silence and deformity. No revelation could justify the suffering carved into this bloodline. Daniel rose, looking out toward the Kentucky hills. Somewhere beyond those ridges, echoes of silence still lingered. Other sons, perhaps hidden, perhaps gone. The Whitaker legacy wasn't just history. It was a warning carved into bone. As the men left the archives, the final truth settled heavily. The legacy of silence was not divine. It was man-made. It was the product of obsession, ignorance, and cruelty masquerading as faith. For the Whitaker sons, their journey had only begun. Rescued from silence, they entered a world that could never undo their past. Yet their existence would forever remind others what blind devotion can destroy.